Today at Reader's Corner, Anthony Doerr talking about his new novel, All the Light We Cannot See.
For me, it was such a challenge. It was my first real sustained historical fiction, and I rarely had an idea of what each space these characters moved through looked exactly like. The more I read about the war, I got interested in the way the whole Ministry of Propaganda in the Third Reich used radio as a tool to hammer this awful nationalism into the heads of poor people in particular. If it is a love story, it's certainly trying to skirt a lot of those cliches. I don't worry so much as long as the emotions feel true. Each of these characters makes one or two incredibly brave decisions.
I'm Bob Custra, president of Boise State University. Welcome to Reader's Corner. Today's guest needs no introduction for many of our listeners. For those of us who love a great read, Anthony Doerr's name is a familiar one. The author of 2 short story collections, a memoir, and now 2 novels, Anthony Doerr's fiction has won a raft of awards. He is the recipient of 4 O. Henry Prizes, 3 Pushcart Prizes, the Rome Prize, a Guggenheim Fellowship, the National Magazine Award, and the Sunday Times EFG Short Story Award, the largest prize in the world for a single short story. I don't have time here to list all the honors Tony's work has received. This is just a sampling. I'm pleased that Tony could join me in our studios today to talk about his much-anticipated new novel, All the Light We Cannot See, which is being released this coming Tuesday. The novel is set during World War II and tells the stories of a blind French girl and a German boy and how their lives eventually intertwine. It also is a story about the magic of radio, the power of love, a mythical diamond known as the Sea of Flames, and the humanity and courage of ordinary people caught up in the most horrific of circumstances. Anthony Doerr's other books include The Shell Collector, About Grace, 4 Seasons in Rome, and Memory Wall. He has taught in Boise State's MFA program in creative writing and was Idaho's writer-in-residence from 2007 to 2010. Tony Doerr, welcome back to Reader's Corner.
Thank you so much, Dr. Custer. It's a treat.
This is just great to have you with us today and to talk about this book. 10 years in the making. That's really fascinating, given the fact that we all here in Boise know you are very prolific, very busy, not just with writing novels, short stories, the Rome book, but also with teaching part-time and raising a family and being available for the Log Cabin, our own literary club here in Boise. That's a lot of work. And yet you say this is 10 years in the making. That means you're doing this while you're doing a lot of other things. How does that work?
Yeah, part of the reason it took so long is that I wrote 2 other books, really as procrastination from this book because I found it so difficult. And yeah, of course, you're always working on other things, just like everybody else. Nobody's as busy as you are in town. I feel like I had to just keep it on life support during those times when I'm writing much different things, whether you're writing journalism or short stories. But for me, it was such a challenge. It was my first real sustained historical fiction, and I had no idea, rarely had an idea of what each space these characters moved through looked exactly like. I didn't know if the streetlights were electric. I didn't know exactly how much kerosene or petroleum was available during the war, or even how much fresh fruit or fresh fish. So often, if you're setting something now, I have a university professor go home, I can readily imagine what's in his refrigerator. But in 1938, I wasn't quite sure, especially in 1941, after the Germans come in and occupy France. It wasn't quite clear to me. So I'd have to quickly backtrack and fall into these little wormholes of research. I looked at tons of photographs and even look at old Sears catalogs, just trying to imagine what kind of products would be in people's houses. And I'm a very detail-oriented writer. I like to try to make each space very vivid for a reader, and a lot of that was just long, painstaking hours of doing research.
So talk to us about the title, All the Light We Cannot See. I mean, immediately I thought of the little girl who becomes blind at age 6, who is one of the protagonists of the book, but there's a lot more to this than that.
Yes. The title was one of the very first things I had. It was 2004. I was riding a train from Princeton, where I had a year-long fellowship, to New York City to meet my publisher, and we were entering Penn Station, and the guy in front of me is on his old 2004 Qualcomm telephone, and his call dropped. We're entering this concrete sweeping over our heads, and we're probably 100 feet underground. And he got angry. He actually started like rapping the phone with his knuckles. He had been talking about the Matrix or the Matrix sequel or something. And, and you realize it's sort of absurd that he got that mad, but also that we'd all kind of forgotten what an incredible achievement and a miracle this thing is that he's holding. He's talking to somebody perhaps 1,000 miles away, and they're having a rather banal conversation just using a little transmitter and receiver, the size of a postage stamp in this device. And that for the entire history of humanity up to that point, this was an entirely impossible thing. And yet here he was, achieving this miracle. So that night I started a story in which a girl broadcasts a story to a boy who is trapped. I didn't know how or why he might be trapped. And I didn't know what story she was reading, but I knew I wanted to somehow convey that there's all this light around us carrying messages, that it's not just visible light, which is this tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum, but all these things around us, not just, microwaves and cosmic rays, but radio waves. Right now, whoever's listening to this is flying into your automobile or your headphones amazingly, invisibly, just using invisible light. And really, for the history of humanity, to hear the voice of a stranger in your head or in your home, that was a very strange thing. You had to see the person you were hearing. And, now Shauna and my kids go out of town and I have to turn on the television or something seems too quiet, It's crazy. It's like I'm not used to not hearing the voices of strangers. And that's all flipped in less than 100 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously there's a fascination with radio. What is it about radio that captured your imagination for the book?
Primarily, the more I read about the war, how radio was used as a tool for evil. Later, I got interested and in the book, you can see how Marie and her uncle use it as a tool for salvation, a tool for resistance. But the way Goebbels in particular, but really the whole Ministry of Propaganda in the Third Reich used radio as a tool to hammer this awful nationalism into the heads of poor people in particular. There was a state-sponsored radio receiver called the Volksempfänger, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, that was subsidized by the government. It could only receive 3 or 4 nationally broadcast-controlled stations. It couldn't receive any foreign radio stations, and that was the radio most German citizens were able to afford. And so, of course, you'd want it. It would be exciting. You could listen to music. You could listen to martial anthems. But there'd be these really creepy radio plays in which all the villains have hooked noses or that are Jewish. And so there's all these really insidious ways, particularly with children, to reinforce this corrupt government agenda. And it was primarily implemented through radio.
So set up the book for us, the two protagonists, Marie and Werner. Tell us a little bit about them. Obviously, as I said in talking with you before this interview, I don't want to give away any endings or anything, but I think it's nice to know a little bit about how you came up with these folks.
You bet. Marie, she goes blind when she's 6 years old. Her father is the locksmith. He's the head locksmith at the Natural History Museum in Paris. And when she turns 10, the looming invasion of the Germans into Paris comes. France really poorly handled the invasion of Paris. They kept saying it's never going to happen. Nobody wanted to repeat the horrors of World War I. And so really the museum, the Louvre, the Natural History Museum, they had very little notice, really just weeks before they understood, wow, Paris might be taken. And so there was this real push to get all these treasures, these incredible treasures, really, not only out of the Louvre, but out of the Natural History Museum, these fossils, gemstones of incalculable value, all kinds of, meteorites, gold, and all this stuff had to be protected, locked up, or moved into, safer areas north or south of the city. So I imagine the locksmith is very involved in that, and what may or may not be the museum's most valuable diamond. They make 4 replicas of it. Maybe one is given to the locksmith, maybe not. You're not quite sure. And then they end up fleeing Paris in June of 1940 and going to the seaside Breton town of Saint-Malo. And then meanwhile, the novel follows Werner, who is an orphan in a coal town in Germany, near Essen, Germany. And he has a younger sister named Jutta, who he feels very responsible for. But he knows, especially during the Depression in the 30s, child labor laws just kind of went out the window. And he knows that he's going to be sent down in the mines at age 15, which is the very place that his father was killed. But Werner turns out to be quite gifted with radios, repairing them. He gets a little reputation in town for being able to go into the neighbors' houses and fix broken receivers. And as the war starts to build up, and he's worried he's also getting close to the age 15, he ends up fixing the radio for a party official, for a very important person, who recommends Werner for these elite schools, this really creepy set of schools that were real things, where they accepted only the, quote, racially pure. So he undergoes these kind of brutal tests, but I'm hoping the reader understands why Werner continues to pursue this course of action. His only other choice is to die in the mines. And here's something that's holding out this light of promise for him, and he doesn't fully understand all the repercussions of what they're going to be teaching him at this school. So at the end of maybe the first 100 pages, you can see Marie heading to Saint-Malo and Werner heading to this paramilitary school where he'll be taught all kinds of nasty things.
You're listening to Anthony Doerr talking about his new novel, All the Light We Cannot See. When I read about Marie and her father at the Natural History Museum, I couldn't help but think about the intersection of the Monuments Men, which comes along, and I wondered, you're sitting there writing this book, or the book's just finished. Obviously, this whole monuments thing, the movie and the book, both came out after you're way into this thing, but wasn't that a little bit of a coincidence?
Yes. I kept telling Shauna, we'd go to the movies down at Edwards, and I'd see that, cardboard cutout from the Monuments Men. I'm like, oh, boy. But ultimately, they don't intersect too closely, and I think it's an incredibly important and untold story. I think following, these men who would risk their lives to save, cultural treasures all around Europe is a really important story. And yeah, they do intersect, especially this diamond hunter, this much more stereotypical German. His name is von Rumpel, who's searching for the Sea of Flames, this mythical diamond that may or may not be with Marie. His job is a real thing, in which Hitler wanted to collect all these works of art in this one great Führer museum in Linz, Austria, where they would collect all of Europe's cultural treasures in this totalitarian, massive sprawling complex, and his job was to try to reel in Europe's greatest gemstones for that museum.
So many people who have read your book, the early reviewers, commented on the fact that it's really about good people trying to do good things for each other under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. As a writer, is that the goal, or is that just a byproduct of the narrative that comes through in your book?
That's a complicated question for me to answer. Your own worldview is not something you can determine, and that I do believe in, maybe not the inherent goodness of people, but in the goodness of people is something I can't really change. Marie was much easier. Her uncle gets wound up into the resistance, and she really never makes a decision that will hurt somebody. Werner, however, is a much more morally complicated figure, in that he makes plenty of decisions that hurt people, but if he doesn't make those decisions, he'll probably be killed himself. So I struggle with that all along. Really, one of the central questions for me in the book is something Jutta asks her brother, Werner, early, in which he says, is it right to do something just because everybody else is doing it? I think we're very rarely presented with such high-level moral questions in terms of right or wrong, but we are presented with that question in lots of different ways, in terms of consuming resources, in terms of how we treat the environment, how we treat each other. Do we have enough strength to think critically about it? Just because everybody else around us is doing something, should we be doing it as well? So that question haunted the book as I created it.
Werner has this friend, is Frederick? Is that the... And he had to make some really difficult choices in that regard. And that really does put the writer in the position of having to declare a moral standard of some sort here and making a call. Help us understand how that happened.
Yeah, Frederick is somebody Werner meets at this Napola school, and Schopflorte is this paramilitary school we mentioned earlier. Frederick is in love with birds. In many ways, he reminds me of one of my sons, just kind of a dreamer, and tends to maybe space out more than some of the other kids. But there's nothing wrong with that, except maybe if you end up in this incredibly totalitarian regime. And this school is bent on ferreting out weakness. Who's the weakest, and how do we get rid of them? How do we strengthen the core? They call it the body. And so Frederick is just born at the wrong time, and he loves the paintings of Audubon, and he loves to look for birds, and all those things aren't quite the kind of values that are rewarded by this school. So, late in the book there's a line, what the war did to dreamers. And in a lot of ways, Werner, too, is a dreamer. He just wants to focus on electromagnetism and math and fixing radios. And he's not really all that interested in killing, and yet he's locked into this situation that is really bent on killing and strengthening the so-called greater race and all these awful things. So, Frederick gets wound up in a very sad way in that situation.
By the time Werner and Marie wind up in Saint-Malo, it's really a riveting part of the story because you can see what's coming. The Americans, strangely enough, not the Germans, are getting ready to do significant devastation to this town. And maybe you could help us, first of all, with the history behind it, because that was, I believe, you said that's one of the things that drove you to this book was your visit there years ago when you had an opportunity to learn more about it. But tell us what we did in this case. Very strange.
Yeah, Saint-Malo is a town in the northern coast of France in Brittany. It's right on the ocean, and it is a magnificent place. The first time I went there, I had to sit through this long French dinner where they were asking me questions about my other novel, Antony, and everybody's smoking, and then I just couldn't wait to get outside. And it was after dark, and there are old medieval walls around the entire city. It was a city of corsairs, of state-sanctioned piracy, basically, and they would take their ships out and raid particularly English ships, take all their stuff, and then sail back to this, fortified city on the coast. And walking these ramparts, the tops of the ramparts around the city, is just this glorious thing. You can see the sea glimmering in the moonlight all around you. And then if you turn to your left, you see in the windows of all these granite grand mansions. They're glowing, you're up on the third floor. And I was captivated. The next day, we didn't have anything to do. I spent 12 hours just walking all around the city through it. And I thought, this is where I want to set my next book. And it wasn't until I walked through it with my editor and I said, look how old all these buildings are. It's amazing. We have nothing this old in the United States. He said, actually, the American Air Force bombed this city and destroyed, I think it's 88% of the city was totally destroyed in 1944.
The walls included?
The walls were so strong that the pictures are amazing. You can see them crumbling. And I'll show them, some of them at my event here in Boise, that they would withstand incredible amounts of artillery and aerial bombardment. But everything was beat up really badly. The steeple on the cathedral fell. I think there were 900 buildings in the city, and something like 700 of them were fully destroyed. So it really took over a decade to rebuild, painstakingly rebuild this place. Then I thought, here we are. We're used to thinking, especially in Normandy and Brittany, of Americans as heroes, Canadians, Britons coming over and really, routing out the evil Germans. And, here's an example where, did we need to use all this force? This was the first time napalm was ever used in warfare, was in Saint-Malo. And part of it was a lack of intelligence. There were so many underground tunnels in the city, and the Germans, when they built up the Atlantic Wall, they built an underground hospital, they had water tanks, they had phone lines to Berlin, and we just didn't understand how many Germans were in the city. By that point in August, we had made really good inroads up in Normandy. We were on our way to Paris, and here was this last really stronghold on the coast. And so, you can understand, of course, why we would drop a lot of, we were sure most civilians were out, although, of course, Marie, her uncle, says many civilians were not. But you can understand why we came in hot.
And you use the tunnels in the novel to tell part of this story.
Yes, no question. And these old cellars, these corsairs would build these old, really impregnated cellars to keep all their loot, and that's where I end up having a Werner trap for really much of the current story of the novel, the 7-day siege of Saint-Malo. That's a place that I imagined maybe could withstand artillery and bombing, and yet be trapped in there would be awful, especially in the summer when it's so hot.
Certainly the work of the French resistance is one of the great stories, narratives of World War II, and you tell it. And there's one particular scenario I'd like you to talk about, the message in a loaf. Did Tony Doerr make that up, or did he actually do research and find that was one of their tactics?
Yes, great question. I don't know the answer. I'm sure I didn't make it up, but it just kind of came to me. Etienne, Marie's uncle, broadcasts numbers. He does not even know what the numbers signify, although he has a feeling there may be positions of Germans, and it may actually be, in a sense, death sentences. He's saying, here's where Germans are. So it's morally another complicated thing he's doing, but he ends up hopefully I'm not giving away too much by saying he ends up broadcasting numbers through a transmitter that he builds in his attic. And the way he gets those numbers is by having Marie pick up loaves of bread with little coils of paper inside. And I'm not sure that that's exactly a tool that was used, but there were so many incredibly innovative ways that they had pigeons fly around with codes strapped to their legs. They'd use like little light towers like the ancient Greeks where they'd flash Morse code lights between towns. So all these amazing ways to try to undercut the Germans are so interesting to me.
Our guest today is Anthony Doerr, talking about his new novel, All the Light We Cannot See. So, when you start reading this book, you are led to believe that, of course, Werner and Marie are going to somehow intersect here in the course of this narrative. But I must say I was a little surprised that it took so long, because I kept waiting and waiting, and that builds the suspense. I'm not complaining. It was a great way to build the suspense in the novel. But then toward the end of the book, I thought you did a spectacular job of describing what it was like as Werner tries to assist and help Marie find her way out of this mess and mainly escape the Germans. And I'd like you, if you would, to just read a bit. First of all, you can help our listeners if I didn't adequately explain that, but there's a section in the book, I don't know what page that is, but I think you have it there, that if you could just read that for us.
You bet. So, at this point, Werner is trying to get Marie out of the city. She's blind, and they've declared a few-hour ceasefire. He's not exactly sure how accurate his information is about this ceasefire, but he knows the Americans have agreed to stop bombarding the city just for a few hours in order to get the wounded and civilians out. Werner, I should also mention, can speak a little bit of French, but not very clearly. And Marie, of course, can't speak any German. Now, he says in the clearest French he can muster, here's the pillowcase. He's given her a pillowcase, by the way, as a way of kind of waving a white flag. You run your hand along that wall. Can you feel it? You'll reach an intersection. Keep going straight. The street looks mostly clear. Keep the pillowcase high, right out in front like this. Do you understand? She turns to him and chews her bottom lip. They will shoot. Not with that white flag, not a girl. There are others ahead. Follow this wall. He sets her hand against it a second time. Hurry, remember the pillowcase. And you? I will go in the other direction. She turns her face toward his, and though she cannot see him, he feels he cannot bear her gaze. Won't you come with me? It will be better for you if no one sees you with me. But how will I find you again? I don't know. She reaches for his hand, sets something in his palm, and squeezes his hand into a fist. Goodbye, Werner. Goodbye, Marie-Laure. Then she goes. Every few paces the tip of her cane strikes a broken stone in the street, and it takes a while to pick her way around it. Step, step, pause. Step, step again. Her cane testing, the wet hem of her dress swinging, the white pillowcase held aloft. He does not look away until she is through the intersection, down the next block, and out of sight. He waits to hear voices, guns. They will help her. They must. When he opens his hand, there is a little iron key in his palm.
Wow. I decided to pick up your book again before this interview. I had read it a month or 2 months ago when I received my own advance copy in preparation for this interview. So I went to the office in the morning and decided to go toward the end of the book and read for an hour. And, I really made a mess out of myself. I mean, I had tears in my eyes, and I felt like I was coming out of a movie that had just had a really terrible ending. And the fact is, I wasn't at the end of the book. And it wasn't, I'm not, again, we don't want to give it away, but it wasn't about a terrible ending that brought tears to my eyes. It was about this relationship that these two people who hardly know each other develop in this very short period of time. I mean, I just would like you to comment on that, because I think it is so much the sum and substance of this novel. Somebody said, this isn't a love story. Well, maybe it's not in the traditional sense of a love story, but in one sense, there's love running throughout this entire novel that you've built into it.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, the relationships in each of the characters' families, and you were right to mention what a risk it was for me, and continues to scare me that these two characters don't intersect until about page 400 in the novel, and they're really only together for a few hours, and in a narrative that really covers almost 80 years. Here are two characters that get to spend maybe half of a day together. So if it is a love story, it's certainly trying to skirt a lot of those cliches. I do understand why that one review you read mentioned sentimentality. I don't worry so much as long as the emotions feel true. I don't feel like I'm trying not to resort to any hallmarky kind of emotion here. I feel like each of these characters, these children, really, they are still children, makes one or two incredibly brave decisions, and there are costs to those decisions, but you can see them reverberate as the novel heads into the, really it ends in 2014, so you get to see the novel head into the future lives of the families and the characters.
You know how you're in a movie and and the movie ends and you say, oh, but I wanted to see the last scene where they hugged or where they were reunited. Or in these days especially, in the old days, and I'm old enough to know this, there were a lot of movies where they had all the sentimentality all gathered up at the end so you could feel really good about yourself before you walked out of the movie. Now these things end and it leaves you to your imagination. To your credit, and I would say this to those who think there's any melodrama or over-sentimentality in the book, I found just the opposite. I'm reading this thing, and because I guess I am a sentimentalist, I'm looking for more. And I see you cutting it off. I see you ending the chapter and like, okay, it's time to move on. Use your own imagination for a change. Do you do that consciously, or is that just the way Tony Doerr thinks?
The conscious part in this book is that I don't want to give too much away, but Marie-Laure does survive the war, and I wanted to get her into the present to suggest also the way memory determines what the war is and how the World War II is understood. We're at this amazing point in history now where every day we're losing hundreds of people for whom World War II is memory, and soon World War II will become history in the sense that there won't be anybody left who remembers it. And I worry a lot about that, especially in the way it's presented to children. You see a lot of nice things on the History Channel, but also a lot of very clumsy renditions where the Germans are all these death heads sticking their heads up out of tank hatches, and all the resistance fighters have mustaches and are handsome and are, can build a tank with a paperclip. And I wanted to maybe suggest that things were a lot more complicated, that, maybe it's not morally wrong to empathize with a German citizen, at least in this case, in the case of Werner. And also that Etienne, who is a resistance leader in some strange way, Marie's uncle, actually is kind of a very weak person and makes a lot of he's shell-shocked from the First War, but he makes a lot of, poor decisions and maybe selfish decisions that he shouldn't be making. So it's trying to kind of invert those stereotypes and maybe play with the reader's expectations about what a World War II story, and however sentimental it is, what they expect. So I wanted to get her into the present, and whether or not that extends the ending too long or too short, I just wanted to show that, these people are still out there walking through parks, these older folks who have these incredible experiences in their past, and that these are stories really worth telling. And that really is all the light we cannot see. That's a kind of light that we're not paying attention to, that the windows of narratives are much larger than we're used to seeing, and that's what I was trying to suggest by telling these two children's stories.
To sum it all up, there are so many novelists who are good at telling a yarn, laying out a narrative. There are other novelists who have spent many years in creative writing programs, and they're very good at crafting the language. The key, it seems to me, is finding a way to bring them together. And that's what you have done with All the Light We Cannot See. And the reviewers, over and over again, keep coming back to that this is not only a great story, but the language you use to tell it is really uniquely Tony Doerr's language, and language that you're really becoming nationally known for now. How does that make you feel?
Oh, thanks. That's very nice, Dr. Custer. You've had some wonderful authors on this program. I'm so grateful that this program exists in our town, and I'm flattered that you like the book.
Yeah. Well, it's just really a great read, and I especially appeal to so many of my friends and perhaps a good number of listeners out there that say, oh, I really don't read fiction because I like to learn things, and I like something that has to do with history, and I don't care for fiction. Well, you have to read all the light we cannot see. Tony Doerr, thank you so much for joining us today on Reader's Corner.
Thank you, Dr. Kustra.
Next week, former Oklahoma Congressman Mickey Edwards, author of The Parties versus the People, How to Turn Republicans and Democrats into Americans. The engineer for today's show is Eric Jones. Our producer is Janelle Brown. I'm Bob Kustra. Please join me next week as we talk to today's leading writers about the ideas and issues that help shape our world at Reader's Corner.